Grab your quills, because we're going to go into the world of Thomas Hobbes, the 17th century English philosopher who looked at human nature and decided, yeah, we're all terrible. So put on your fancy breeches, because by the end of this overview, you're going to have a clear and concise understanding of the man who made political philosophy sound like a horror movie pitch. Let's talk about the early years. Born in 1588 in Westport, England, Thomas Hobbes came into the world with perfect dramatic timing. Legend has it that his mother went into labor early because she heard the approaching Spanish Armada. It's like baby Hobbes heard there was conflict brewing and thought, that's my cue. Hobbes' father was a vicar, which is a preacher, and he had a penchant for brawling and abandoning his family. So after one too many fistfights outside his church that they were arguing about Calvinism, Hobbes Sr. disappeared, leaving young Thomas to be raised by a wealthy uncle. It's like the setup for a Dickens novel, but with more philosophy and fewer orphans singing about cruelty. Despite his father's absence, or perhaps because of it, Hobbes proved to be a precocious child. He began studying Latin and Greek at a young age, probably while other kids were still figuring out how to tie their ruffs. By 14, he had already translated Medea from Greek into the Latin verse. It's like he was the 17th century equivalent of that kid who was always finishing the test first and then was like, can I have some extra credit? Let's talk about education. At 15, Hobbes entered Magdalen Hall, Oxford. But don't get too excited. Hobbes, he found the university education to be, in his words, a big bag of poo. Okay, he didn't say it exactly like that, but he did criticize the scholastic philosophy taught at Oxford and said it was useless. It's like he went to a fancy restaurant and complained that the food was all presentation but no substance. So after graduating in 1608, Hobbes becomes a tutor to William Cavendish, later the second Earl of Devonshire. And this gig gave him access to one of the best private libraries in England and the opportunity to travel Europe. It's like he won the 17th century equivalent of a really nerdy lottery. And during his travels, Hobbes met many of the leading intellectuals of his time, including Galileo, René Descartes, and these encounters, they shaped his thinking and probably his ability to name drop at parties. Oh, you're reading Galileo? I had espresso with him last week.
Are you trying to out name drop me?
Now let's talk about Leviathan. Not the biblical character, but this is Hobbes' magnum opus. In 1651, Hobbes publishes his masterpiece, Leviathan. This work, which argues for a strong, centralized government as the only way to save humanity from its worst impulses. So he's going to drop a philosophical bomb on 17th century political thought. It's as if Hobbes looked at the English Civil War and thought, hold my ale. I'm about to fix this whole mess with some really depressing ideas about human nature. So let's get into some of the key concepts you would encounter. The first, the state of nature. Hobbes argues that without government, human life would be solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. It's like he's describing a really bad camping trip, but for all of humanity. The second piece was the social contract. So to escape this terrible state of nature, Hobbes says, we agree to give up some of our natural rights to a sovereign power. It's like we're all signing up for a totalitarian gym membership. It's restrictive, but at least we're not going to be having to worry about getting constantly murdered. 3 is absolute sovereignty. Hobbes argues for an all-powerful sovereign, preferably a monarch, to keep everyone in line. It's like he's proposing a really intense game of Simon Says, where Simon has an army and he could execute you for not touching your nose. 4 is materialist philosophy. Hobbes was a materialist, believing that everything, including human thoughts and emotions, could be explained by matters in motion. It's like he's saying your feelings, just tiny bouncing balls going on in your skull. And then 5 is psychological egoism. Hobbes believed that all human actions, even seemingly altruistic ones, are ultimately done in self-interest. He is the philosophical grandfather of that friend who always says, well, actually, when you talk about doing something nice. Leviathan was controversial from the moment it was published. Royalists thought Hobbes gave too much power to the people, while parliamentarians thought he gave too much power to the sovereign. It's like he managed to anger everyone equally, and that's a pretty good philosophical achievement. Now, Hobbes had other greatest hits of gloom. While Leviathan is his most famous work, he was a prolific writer on a wide variety of subjects, and some of his more notable works, they include, first, On the Citizen. It's an earlier work that outlines many of the ideas later expanded in the Leviathan. It's kind of like the Leviathan, the prequel. He also had On the Body, and this is part of Hobbes' attempt to create a comprehensive philosophical system covering everything from logic to physics. It's like he's trying to be the Wikipedia of the 17th century. The third big one was Behemoth. He just can't get away from these biblical names. And it's a history of the English Civil War written as a dialogue. And so Hobbes decided to write some historical fan fiction about his own times. And then in his later years, we have the translation of Homer. Hobbes translated both the Iliad and the Odyssey. He decided to kind of take a break from scaring people about human nature and decided to scare them with some stories about angry gods and monsters and lightning bolts. Let's talk about Hobbes' influence, the long shadow of pessimism. Despite, or perhaps because of it, his controversial ideas, Hobbes' influence on philosophy and political thought has been quite immense. First, social contract theory. Hobbes is considered one of the founders of social contract theory, which would be further developed by thinkers like John Locke and Rousseau. So it's almost as if Hobbes started a philosophical boy band and Locke and Rousseau, they joined just a little bit later. In sync, anyone? Second, modern state theory. Hobbes' ideas of the state as a mortal god with supreme authority over its citizens has been hugely influential in thinking about the modern state. He sort of provided the theoretical blueprint for every dystopian novel ever. 3, materialism. Hobbes' materialist philosophy, it influenced later thinkers in the empiricist tradition. He is sort of like the philosophical godfather of, if you can't measure it, it doesn't exist.
I'm going to make him an offer he can't refuse.
And then 4, political realism. In international relations theory, Hobbes is seen as a forerunner of political realism, which emphasizes power and self-interest in international affairs. And then 5, psychology. Hobbes' ideas about human motivation and psychology prefigured many later developments in the field. And so he was sort of doing a psychological autopsy on humanity before psychology became what it's known today. So who's the man behind the gloom? Hobbes' human side. Well, we often think of Hobbes as this kind of gloomy, authoritarian philosopher. Yeah, he had his quirks and his contradictions, so here are some fun anecdotes about Hobbes. First is he was the scaredy-cat philosopher. Hobbes was famously fearful. He was born prematurely because his mother was frightened by the Spanish Armada, and he once said, "Fear and I were born twins." He is living proof of his own philosophy about fear and self-preservation. 2, he was the math enthusiast. Later in life, he became obsessed with geometry. There are a lot of things you can get obsessed with. Geometry? Even trying unsuccessfully to square the circle. He thought, if I can just solve this geometric problem, maybe people will stop being jerks to each other. 3, the late bloomer. Hobbes didn't publish his first major work until he was 54. He is the philosophical poster boy for it's never too late to start scaring people with your ideas about human nature. And then 4, he was the witty conversationalist. Despite his gloomy philosophy, Hobbes was known for his wit in conversation. And so he just kind of saved all of his optimism for his social life, kept the pessimism to his writings. And then 5, the longevity paradox. Despite believing that life in the state of nature was nasty, brutish, and short, Hobbes lived to the ripe old age of 91. It's like he was determined to disprove his own philosophy by sheer longevity. So why should we care about this grumpy old philosopher from 4 centuries ago? Well, for all his doom and gloom, Hobbes offers some really profound insights. The first is the importance of security. Hobbes recognized that without basic security, all other social goods become impossible. What he's saying is, sure, freedom is great, but have you tried not being murdered? Second is the social nature of power. Hobbes understood that political power, it's not just about force, but about people's belief and consent. And so he discovered that the real Leviathan was actually the friends we make along the way. 3 is the danger of moral absolutism. By grounding his political philosophy in self-interest rather than abstract moral principles, Hobbes offered a more pragmatic approach to politics. He is the philosophical ancestor of every let's agree to disagree meme. And then the psychological basis of politics. His insights into human psychology and its relationship to politics, it prefigured many later developments in political psychology. And then next is the importance of definitions. Hobbes emphasized the importance of clear definitions in philosophical and political discourse. So as we wrap up our journey through the paranoid landscape of Hobbes' philosophy, you might be feeling a bit anxious about human nature, but don't worry, that's exactly how Hobbes would want you to feel. So remember, as you're wrestling with these pessimistic concepts, that understanding Hobbes is like trying to herd cats in the state of nature. Just when you've got it under control, everything descends into chaos.